Death Valley in California's Mojave Desert is one of the harshest and most inhospitable environments on Earth, where daytime temperatures can soar up to 134 degrees Fahrenheit or 56.7 degrees Celsius, the highest ever recorded on the surface of the Earth. The 7,800 square kilometer expanse boasts a variety of dramatic landscapes, from sun-baked salt flats to drifting sand dunes and rugged buttes and canyons. But one secluded corner of Death Valley conceals a rare and unusual natural phenomenon which has baffled explorers and scientists for nearly a century. Scattered across the billiard table surface of a small, remote, dry lake bed are hundreds of stones ranging in size from pebbles to small boulders, behind which stretch long tracks or furrows carved into the mud. These tracks reveal that somehow these stones have traveled across the valley floor, sometimes for hundreds of meters. But what force could possibly have moved these stones? Animals, winds, gravitational or magnetic anomalies, something even stranger? This is the story of the mysterious sailing stones of Racetrack Playa. The earliest known account of the sailing stones comes from Nevada prospector Joseph Crook, who visited Racetrack Playa with his wife in 1915. Skeptical that such large, heavy objects could move on their own, Mrs. Cook reportedly marked the location of one of the stones, which over the following years gradually traveled across the valley floor. However, it would be another 3 decades before any systematic attempt was made to study the phenomenon. In 1948, geologists James McAllister and Alan Agnew surveyed the region and wrote a general description of the stones and their furrows, which they published in the Geologic Society of America Bulletin. In the report, the authors provided a potential explanation for the stone's movement, speculating that, quote, the scrapers were propelled over the muddy surface of the playa, initially from the rim, by strong gusts of wind blowing consecutively from different directions, such as erratic whirlwinds that commonly produce dust devils. Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs looking to stand out online. Whether you're launching a new project or running a growing business, Squarespace makes it simple to create a beautiful website, engage your audience, and sell anything: products, content, even your time, all in one place. If you've ever tried to build a website, you know the struggle. There's just a lot of things going on between design, functionality, and keeping it all organized. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but that's where Squarespace comes in. With their design intelligence feature, they combine decades of expert design knowledge with AI technology to help you build a stunning, personalized website. It's like having a pro designer on your side, even if you don't know the first thing about coding. And when it comes to actually running your website, Squarespace Payments makes life easier. You can accept payments in a snap with popular methods like Apple Pay or Klarna, all while keeping everything in one place. You can even sell your own online courses with Squarespace's course creation tools, upload videos, customize your layout, and charge for access with ease. So whether you're just getting started or looking to level up your online presence, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, visit squarespace.com/brainfood to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain using the code BRAINFOOD. Big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and now back to it. According to this theory, the occasional rains and snows which fall on Racetrack Playa during the winter create a thin layer of mud slippery enough to allow the stones to be pushed along by sufficiently strong winds. In other words, the stones quite literally sail. The next major study was undertaken in 1952 by National Park Service Ranger Lewis T. Kirk. Over a 3-day period, Kirk collected a mountain of data examining and classifying the sediments of the valley floor. He weighed and measured hundreds of sailing stones, photographing, measuring, and plotting the shape and orientation of their tracks. In the process, he made a number of discoveries that would prove invaluable to future investigators. For example, he found that the trails measured anywhere from 10 to 240 meters in length, and while most were straight or slightly curved, some zigzagged abruptly, while at least 2 traced complete loops. Many of the tracks, even the zigzagging ones, also ran parallel to one another, suggesting that the same force had moved them all together as a unit. Stranger still, Kirk found no relationship between the size or shape of the stones and the length and shape of the tracks, with the heaviest and most streamlined stones traveling just as far, and in many cases further, than the smallest and flattest. Though in his final report, he provided a number of alternate potential causes for the phenomenon, including seismic activity, magnetic anomalies, and even propeller blasts from prospectors' aircraft landing in the valley, like McAllister and Agnew, he concluded that the most likely force moving the stones was the wind, which, from personal experience, he knew could blow up to 60 kilometers per hour across the valley floor. He also knew that occasional summer cloudbursts and winter storms could flood the surface of the lakebed, creating the required low-friction layer of mud. Kirk's pioneering survey was published later that year in the Journal of Sedimentary Petrology, alongside another article written by geologist Thomas Clements. Skeptical that wind alone could move the stones, Clements set out to determine whether the same phenomenon occurred anywhere else. His search led him to Little Bonnie Claire, another dry lake bed in Death Valley, very similar to Racetrack Playa. To his surprise, he discovered a number of small sailing stones with shorter tracks measuring up to 42 meters long. But while the tracks exhibited the same general shapes as those at Racetrack Playa, very few of them were parallel, a fact Clements attributed to, quote, different rock sizes and local surface irregularities compounded by gusts from varying directions and varying competencies. During a survey, a rainstorm struck the Playa, flooding a large portion of the lake bed under around a centimeter of water. As Clements observed, the clay surface was soft and extremely slippery, but beneath the topmost inch, the material was quite firm, so that a person walking on the Playa sank down no more than an inch or two. The following year, geologist John Shelton flew to Racetrack Playa to conduct a series of systematic experiments. After flooding a small section of the lakebed, Shelton placed a series of laboratory-cut stone cubes ranging from 1 to 6 centimeters in size onto the mud surface and exposed them to the prop blast from his aircraft, using an anemometer to measure wind speed and a spring scale to measure the force on the cubes. At first, he observed no movement, noting that even 3 to 4 hours of soaking the ground is not enough to produce a smooth, slippery film of mud on the Playa. However, realizing that his technique might not accurately simulate natural processes, he proceeded to flood a smaller 1 by 1 meter area and smooth the resulting mud with a trowel to produce a completely flat, smooth surface. This time, the prop blast, measured at 67.5 kilometers per hour, was sufficient to move blocks weighing up to 500 grams. Larger blocks did not move, while smaller ones tumbled instead of sliding. Shelton repeated this experiment in a small, artificially flooded depression at the south end of the Playa and succeeded in making larger cubes and even natural boulders slide. In his final report, Shelton speculated that since the finest clay particles are naturally found at the top of the lakebed crust, flooding these areas produced a stickier mud that impeded the movement of the stones. However, in the southern depression, these fine sediments had been stripped away, resulting in a slipperier mud. Furthermore, he posited that the geography of the surrounding mountains could produce wind speeds exceeding that of his aircraft prop blast, allowing heavier stones to be moved. The next major study of Racetrack Playa was made by George M. Stanley, who, over 3 expeditions conducted in 1952, 1953, and 1954, conducted an extensive geographic survey of hundreds of sailing stones and their tracks. In his report, published in the Geographical Society of America Bulletin in 1955, Stanley proposed a radical new mechanism to explain the movement of the stones, and that was ice. Due to its high elevation, at 1,132 meters above sea level, temperatures at Racetrack Playa can sometimes dip below freezing, causing the thin layer of water that forms after summer rainstorms or spring snowmelt to develop a crust of ice. This ice sheet, Stanley argued, acted as a gigantic sail, catching the winds and dragging along stones and other objects embedded within it. This theory neatly explained many of the peculiarities associated with the sailing stones. For example, the fact that many of the stones traveled along parallel tracks, something which could not be explained by erratically shifting winds. It makes sense if all the stones were carried by the same continuous ice sheet. According to Stanley, abrupt curves or zigzags in the tracks were caused by the ice sheet being deflected by the curved stone walls of the Playa or by the ice breaking up and rotating as it struck more solidly embedded boulders and other obstacles on the lakebed. The ice sheet theory further explained a number of perplexing anomalies observed by Stanley. For example, one 12-kilogram stone slid a considerable distance with its long axis oriented at right angles to its path of travel. Had this stone been pushed by wind alone, physics dictates that it should have either turned into the wind or tumbled rather than slid. Not so, however, if it was firmly embedded in ice. In another case, a 14-kilogram stone slid a long distance through an area covered in small pebbles. While a fellow geologist suggested that the stone might have slid up to this area, tumbled over it, then continued sliding on the other side, Stanley rebutted this explanation, writing in his final report that, quote, "It would be contrary to the laws of transport for wind to roll away this large rock and leave the hundreds of tiny stones that constitute the point traversed, even though most of the paved stones protect one another from wind. Also, to slide a rock over the stones unlubricated by wet clay and slightly upgrade would require more force than wind could apply to it without ice as an intermediary." Later investigators, however, countered that ice was not absolutely necessary to explain the lack of tumbling. After all, they argued the wet clay on the valley floor is not only slippery, but very sticky, and could thus glue the stones down and prevent them from tumbling even in high winds. In response, Stanley pointed to the fact that even lightweight materials like sticks or animal droppings also left long tracks along the valley floor. Had they been blown by the winds, they would simply have tumbled and left little trace. These tracks could only be explained if these materials were embedded in a sheet of ice. Stanley further supported his hypothesis by citing an incident which occurred on December 3, 1952 in Nevada. On that day, the central transcontinental telephone line was suddenly disconnected, leaving thousands of customers without service. Repair crews traced the break to Toulon Lake, a small flooded depression in Carson Sink east of Reno. The lake, which sat at an altitude similar to that of Racetrack Playa, had partially frozen, with an ice sheet 10 centimeters thick and 5 kilometers long forming along the line of telephone poles. Winds of around 50 kilometers per hour had then caused the ice sheet to move, uprooting the poles and their metal-reinforced concrete bases and carrying them over 100 meters from their original locations. To Stanley, this incident clearly demonstrated the enormous motive power of even thin ice sheets in relatively mild winds. As for why this phenomenon was not more widespread across Death Valley and other similar dry lake beds, Stanley speculated that, quote, a logical answer might be that most other players of Mojave Colorado Desert are lower, and temperatures to develop sufficient ice would depend considerably on elevation. Over the following decade, several other researchers uncovered additional evidence discounting the original wind-only hypothesis for the sailing stones. For example, in 1960, W.E. Sharp towed stone blocks from a flooded, mud-filled channel at Harper Dry Lake in San Bernardino County, California, and measured the force needed to move them. He discovered that all but the lightest stones tended to sink through the upper layer of low-friction mud into the firmer lower layers, which offered far more resistance to sliding. Too much, he concluded, for the stones to be moved by anything but the most unusually powerful winds. Then, in 1962, physicist Edward Kreutz proposed a unique explanation for the stone's movement, based not on wind or ice, but rather the expansion of clay as it absorbed water. According to Kreutz, this explanation caused the lakebed surface to rise and any stones lying on top to slide down the newly created elevation. And as the water percolated horizontally through the lakebed, this ripple of expanding clay progressively pushed the stones along the valley floor. This hypothesis neatly explained why most of the sailing stones tended to travel from the periphery of the playa into its interior. According to Kreutz, the clay at the edges of the valley is shallower and thus expands more, creating a contracting ripple that pushes stones inwards. This differential expansion was supported by laboratory experiments conducted with bentonite, a common type of clay derived from ancient volcanic ash. As for the sudden changes of direction often observed in the sailing stones, Kreutz argued that the uneven composition of the clay sometimes causes certain areas to expand faster than others, creating occasional changes in gradients that cause the stones to slide off in a different direction. Indeed, he explained he observed cases of stones completely reversing direction and sliding back toward the edge of the playa by stating, quote, with continued rainfall, the swelling of the thicker mud near the center of the lake will be greater than that of the thinner layer near the shore. While this hypothesis was largely convincing, it could not account for certain observed phenomena, such as stones moving parallel to the playa's western shore, movement that cannot be easily explained by the predicted direction of the clay expansion. It should be noted here that at this point, nobody had ever observed the sailing stones actually moving, with all investigations and theorizing being based on the trails they left on the playa floor. The first actual measurement of the stones in motion was carried out by Robert P. Sharp and Dwight L. Carey, who visited Racetrack Playa on 16 different occasions between 1968 and 1975. During this period, the pair marked the position of 30 stones with metal stakes, then returned intermittently to track their progress. And because geologists are weird, lonely people, each of the stones was given a woman's name, including Mary Ann, Peggy, and Hortense. Of the 30 stones, 28 moved at least once during the 7-year research period, and while Sharp and Carey never directly witnessed the rocks in motion, their measurements revealed some intriguing patterns. For example, they found that the stone's movement was very intermittent, with the periods of greatest motion occurring during the winter and specifically just after heavy rain or snowfall, lending even more credence to George Stanley's ice sheet hypothesis. At the same time, Sharp and Carey conducted a simple experiment. They planted 7 lengths of steel rebar into the ground, 76 centimeters apart, to form a 170 centimeter diameter circular enclosure they dubbed the corral. In this, they placed a half-kilogram stone. If the sailing stones were actually carried by ice sheets, the theory went, then the stakes would break up said sheets and prevent the stone from leaving the corral. But when the pair next returned to Racetrack Playa, they made a baffling discovery. The stone had left the corral, barely missing one of the rebar stakes before traveling 8.5 meters to the northwest. Sharp and Carey then placed 2 more, heavier stones in the corral, one of which moved 5 years later. The other, however, stayed put throughout the entire study period. This unexpected result appeared to shatter the hitherto popular ice sheet hypothesis, forcing Sharp and Carey to conclude that the stones were indeed moved solely by the wind as had originally been suggested. As for how the wind was able to overcome the high friction of even fully saturated clay, the pair posited that under certain conditions, a thin film of extremely slippery ice formed on the lakebed, creating a near frictionless surface over which the stones could slide. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, researchers continued to experiment and develop theoretical models which variously supported or discounted the ability of the wind to push heavy stones across the player floor. For example, in 1996, studies conducted by David Bacon at Owens Dry Lake Player revealed that due to the lakebed's extremely smooth, flat surface, wind speeds at ground level can gust up to 140 km per hour during particularly violent winter storms. Bacon hypothesized that such gusts overcame the static friction between the stones and the player floor, while less powerful sustained winds continued to move them against the much lower dynamic friction. But without a true smoking gun, the exact mechanism behind the stone's movement remained a tantalizing mystery. Of course, in the absence of solid evidence, many alternative and outlandish theories were put forward, including that the stones were being moved by people as some kind of elaborate prank, or, say it with me now, aliens, because it's always aliens, isn't it? It was not until the 2010s that the mysterious sailing stones finally began to reveal their secrets. Starting in November 2013, a multidisciplinary team led by Ralph D. Lorenz of the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University installed custom-built GPS trackers in hundreds of limestone blocks of various shapes and sizes and placed these at the southern end of the player near the largest concentration of natural stones. The trackers were designed to record position and temperature data once per hour, then continuously, once they drifted away from magnets buried directly beneath the blocks. At the same time, wind velocities were continuously recorded by an automatic weather station and the blocks photographed by digital time-lapse cameras. Despite Lorenz later stating that, quote, "I thought it was going to be the most boring experiment in the history of science," the results were immediate and astonishing, with several of the blocks traveling over 200 meters between December 2013 and January 2014. Just like Sharp and Carey had observed back in the 1960s and 70s, the greatest movement followed a significant period of rainfall and was associated with the formation of a large shallow pond at the southern end of the player. Furthermore, the time-lapse cameras revealed for the first time the true driver of the stone's movement. It was, you guessed it, ice. Surprisingly, however, the stones are moved not by large continuous sheets of ice, as George Stanley had proposed in the 1950s, but rather much smaller and thinner ones, ice floes. As the researchers explained in their final report, to quote, "The pond repeatedly froze as nighttime temperatures dipped below freezing for most days to the end of our observation on January 9th, 2014, when the pond still covered a quarter of the player surface. The pond eventually evaporated completely by the second week in February 2014. In contrast with previous hypotheses of powerful winds or thick ice floating rocks off the player's surface, the process of rock movement that we have observed occurs when the thin 3 to 6 millimeter window pane ice sheet covering the player pool begins to melt in late morning sun and breaks up under light winds of 4 to 5 meters a second. Floating ice panels, tens of meters in size, push multiple rocks at low speeds of 2 to 5 meters a minute along trajectories determined by the direction and velocity of the wind, as well as that of the water flowing under the ice. Observed rock movements occurred on sunny, clear days following nights of sub-freezing temperatures. Steady light winds and morning sun caused floating ice to break up near midday, accompanied by widespread popping sounds from fragmenting ice panels. Ice initially broke into floating panels tens of meters in size that became increasingly fragmented and separated by open, rippled water as melting continued. Floating ice sheets driven by wind stress and flowing water pushed rocks resting on the player surface, in some cases moving 60 rocks in a single event. Rocks move slowly and somewhat episodically during move events. For instance, on January 9th, 2014, a rock was observed to move at 1 to 2 meters a minute for about 18 seconds at 12:50 p.m. This rock was pushed by an ice panel estimated to be about 5 to 8 meters long upstream of the stone." End quote. Now, initially, the researchers hypothesized that thick ice collars from around the stones themselves, acting like miniature life preservers, lifted the stones out of the thicker, more resistant mud and allowed the wind to push them through the thin upper layer of water. However, this did not turn out to be the case. Rather, quoting again, "A surprise is the thickness of ice involved in rock movements. Ice sheets 3 to 6 millimeters thick are insufficient to float rocks off the player's surface, as proposed in some models, and in any case, we observed that ice melts first around rocks. However, moving sheets of ice tens of meters in extent, but only a few millimeters thick, are clearly effective at moving rocks in their path. forces on stones increase when multiple sheets of ice pile on the upstream side of a rock and increase the effective surface area of the rock exposed to stresses of wind and flowing water." End quote. These findings helped unravel many of the mysteries which had baffled researchers for nearly a century. For example, the erratic and diverging movements of multiple stones, even those spaced closely together, is easily explained by the breakup of ice sheets into smaller ice floes, which can jostle against each other and abruptly change direction as they drift across the flooded player floor. It also explains how stones were able to escape Robert Sharp and Dwight Carey's corral back in the 1970s. Furthermore, the study suggests a potential reason why the sailing stones phenomenon is so rarely observed. The very specific conditions required to move the stones typically take place in the early hours of the morning. Just as Stanley's original ice sheet hypothesis was paralleled by the toppled telephone poles near Reno, Lorenz's ice raft phenomenon finds an analog in certain Arctic tidal inlets which feature large boulder barricades where stones are carried by washed-up ice floes and dropped in place as the ice melts. Other features observed at Racetrack Playa also lend credence to the hypothesis that stones are plucked from the ground by ice rafts, allowing them to be carried more easily over the surface of the floodwaters. To quote again, "A rock with corner-to-corner dimensions of 23 centimeters, 24 centimeters was found at the end of a 14-meter shallow trail. At the start of the trail was a depression that was deeper than the trail, with some deposits around it. The exact mechanism of the deposit formation is not known, but may relate to ice formation. The steep edge of the depression suggests that the rock was not simply pushed out of its partly buried starting point, but instead was lifted out. The very shallow striations defining a track only about 0.12 meters across, about 2/3 as wide as the rock itself, also seemed inconsistent with simple sliding on mud, but suggests instead that the rock was held somewhat above the mud. These indications are consistent with an ice raft forming around the rock and lifting the rock up, allowing it to be dragged by wind or currents to form a shallow trail." The quote ends. After nearly a century of speculation and study, the mystery of the sailing stones of Racetrack Playa finally appears to have been solved. As Ralph Lauren stated in a 2014 interview, "This is transformative. It's not just an anecdotal report, but we have before and after pictures and meteorological information simultaneous with the event. This breaks the back of the problem scientifically. It is ice shove." But the implications of these findings go far beyond an obscure corner of Death Valley, or even our own planet. Brian K. Jackson of NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center joined the research team because the specific geological and meteorological conditions of Racetrack Playa and similar dry lake beds closely resemble those found on the surface of Mars or Saturn's moon Titan. Indeed, in 2005, NASA's unmanned Huygens probe photographed a site on Titan's surface called Ontario Lacus, a large, periodically flooded mudflat strewn with cobblestones, though in this case the occasional precipitation consists not of water but rather liquid hydrocarbons like methane. And while no telltale tracks have yet been found, it is possible that this extraterrestrial lakebed might host its own sailing stones. But for now, we can take pride in the fact that for once a puzzling natural mystery has actually been solved. With any luck, others will follow, be they ball lightning, the Taos hum, and the fairy circles of the Namib Desert. Or maybe we will finally find out how ancient man-made wonders like the Egyptian pyramids, Stonehenge, and the Moai of Easter Island were actually built, if only just to get the ancient aliens crowd to finally shut up.